spelling error, luckily. And I was thinking about what should I do for this colloquium, but I chose to revisit this crux in Romans 5:1. The most widely used contemporary translation of the New Testament in Swedish was published in 1981 by the Swedish Bible Society. In 2014, the Society took the first steps towards a new translation by commissioning a trial translation of two New Testament texts, the Lucan travel narrative and Paul's letter to the Galatians. I was then asked to be a consultant for the project, where my task was to discuss significant textual problems relevant to the translation and to supply footnotes pertaining to these textual problems, a selection of which accompanied the new translation. And subsequently, I made this work available in English in various places. In one case, the Swedish Bible Society had not accepted my recommendation. I was angry. But I wrote this full article published in Journal of Biblical Literature, defending a longer text in Luke 10:41 to 42. I dedicated the first footnote to the Swedish one. Actually, the NRSV updated edition adopted the longer reading as a result. Actually, they told me of my article. Bringing sisters back together. It's very nice stuff. In 2020, the Swedish Bible Society launched a new project, NT 2026, a new Swedish translation of the Greek New Testament to be published in 2026, which marks the 500-year anniversary of the first Swedish translation commissioned by King Gustav Vasa and published in 1526. So it's very important to get this out in that year, next year. Again, I was asked to work on textual criticism in the new translation project. In a total of 33 variation units in the Pauline letters, 7 of which are in Romans, I have argued for other readings than those preferred in the dominant hand edition. Nästlolan 28. These 7 places in Romans are in the appendix on your handout without any comment. So first I was thinking, should I go through these? But I didn't do it. Instead, I will revisit Romans 5:1, where I agree with Nästlolan 28, not to create any. I agree with Nästlolan 28, USB 5, and UBS 6, for that matter, which will retain the same text pending the ECM of Romans. The method I apply represents recent eclecticism, which takes into account external and internal evidence. These traditional criteria of New Testament textual criticism are integrated into the coherence-based genealogical method, which is yet to be applied to the Pauline letters, which are being edited in the series Novum Testamentum Graecum Editio Critica Major, currently in the making, and Houghton is, of course, the principal editor. For this reason, my evaluations of these passages anticipates further work, and it will be interesting to see whether the current textual decisions reflected in Nästlolan 28 are coherent with pre-genealogical evidence and textual decisions yielding genealogical evidence throughout the Corpus Paulinum. During the course of my study, I have had access to and given feedback to Hugh Houghton's forthcoming textual commentary of the Greek New Testament, which will replace, we hope, Metzger's counterpart as a companion to the UBS Greek New Testament. This passage in Romans 5:1, I think, reflects the most drastic change in letter rating from UBS 5 to UBS 6 throughout the Greek New Testament. I might be wrong, but I think it does. Yeah, because the UBS committee assigned it an A letter reading. You can't see this because of this meeting is now being recorded, so we can't see it. the record. An A letter rating, because the committee was fully confident of their decision, made primarily, thank you, on the basis of internal evidence. As Metzger concluded, now, I'm sorry. What did Metzger conclude? Metzger concluded. I have his citation coming. A majority of the committee judged that internal evidence must here take precedence, etc. And only the indicative is consonant with the apostle's argument. The indicative is retained in UBS 6, but Houghton concludes that in this context, the confidence of previous UBS editors is unwarranted, as seen by the adoption of ἔχομεν in the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Yeah. This is a joke. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Okay, the readings and evidence in Greek manuscripts in the apparatus on your handout is cited from the positive ECM Romans apparatus 1.0 at epistula.org. Unless otherwise noted, the versional and patristic evidence is drawn from UBS 5. Below the apparatus, I indicate my preferred reading, as well as that of the Greek New Testament SBL edition, edited by Mike Holmes, and the Greek New Testament of Tyndale House, edited by Peter Williams and Dirk Jonkind, Patrick James, Peter Head, I think, several editors there. My own judgment includes a symbol reflecting my general view of the balance of probabilities, so to speak, the state of the external and internal evidence guiding my decision. So this is the best rating system. Now, it's kind of an invitation to look at the evidence for yourself and judge. Romans 5:1. The choice is, of course, here whether to read the indicative with an omicron. We have peace with God, reading A, or the subjunctive with an omega. Let us keep, or let us hold peace with God, reading B. All modern text editions, except the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, choose the indicative here, but Westcott and Hort prefer the subjunctive. I prefer reading A with the indicative, and here I use the rating E equals I to indicate that the evidence is rather balanced. Internal evidence favors the indicative, whereas external evidence favors the subjunctive, you can say. The two vowels, omicron and omega, could easily have been confused by scribes, especially since they hardly differ in pronunciation. Such confusion may have occurred from an early stage, and certainly several times in the history of transmission and in both directions. It's therefore not surprising that there is no majority text. The many Byzantine manuscripts diverge. It's also notable that corrections have been made at different times, more often from the subjunctive to the indicative. But since confusions could easily occur, internal evidence with reference to the author's theology and style should carry relatively more weight, which is why most editors and translators have preferred reading A, ἔχωμεν, with indicative, despite weaker external support from textual witnesses. The earliest witness to the reading A is arguably the 3rd century majuscule 0220, which has a damage at this point, but almost certainly had the indicative form. Daniel Stevens states in his new edition that, I'm citing, quote, a small trace of ink is retained, though it is visible from the verso because of how that portion of the parchment has been warped. Ink, which suggests the top of a closed round letter, thus omicron. Thus I have cited 0220 in the apparatus with a V, videtur, contra ECM, the ECM apparatus, which has either A or B. So this is one modification I have done on the handout. The correction in Codex Sinaiticus appears to be early, and there are similar corrections from omega to omicron by the same scribe in Galatians 1:1, Revelation 9:21, where these are obvious errors that have been corrected. The correction in Sinaiticus in this case carry as much weight, in my opinion, as the Prima Mons. It's early. The correction in Vaticanus is made later. It's a later layer from 5th to 7th century and does not carry as much weight as the Prima Mons. There is a number of corrections in this layer concerning the variation omicron omega. But the most interesting example is in Galatians 6:10. Araun os kairon ěχωμεν, where a few witnesses have the subjunctive ἔχωμεν, which does not fit the context at all, and was corrected in Vaticanus. So the strongest witnesses to the awkward subjunctive here all have the subjunctive in Romans 5:1, as you can see there. Other passages where a few witnesses replace ěχωμεν with an awkward ἔχωμεν are found in Hebrews 6:19, 1 John 3:21, 1 John 5:14. Yeah. Now, did the opposite ever happen? As Houghton tells us in his commentary, there is only one secure instance of ἔχωμεν with the subjunctive elsewhere in the epistles, and it is in Romans 15:4. Interestingly, the ECM apparatus shows that many scribes erroneously copy the indicative here in a hina clause. Did I? Yeah. Here they are. An indicative and a hina clause. These examples confirm that scribes easily confused ěχωμεν, which was either corrected or later or remained in the text, even if obviously erroneous. The earliest witness for reading B is Marcion in Tertullian, Adversus Marcion 5:13-9, monet justificatos ex fide Christi non ex lege passem ad Deum habere. He exhorts us who have been justified by faith in Christ, not by the law, to have peace or keep peace with God. But as seen in your handout, both readings occur in later Christian authors, although the subjunctive dominates. In 1739, supposedly reflecting Origen's text of Romans, there may be a correction from the subjunctive to the indicative. So Neslalan 28 has it, but this is somewhat uncertain. The ECM currently, the apparatus indicates the correction as videtur. The evidence from the Cairo papyrus 88748 containing Origen's commentary on Romans 3:5 to 5:7 is inconclusive. But in his discussion of Romans 5:1, Origen uses indicative form several times in his discussion, but it's inconclusive what text he had. On the other hand, Rufinus' translation does reflect the subjunctive. Moving on to internal evidence, I prefer the indicative in light of Paul's style and theology, as well as the context in Romans. In my opinion, Paul, at this point in his letter, states that believers have peace with God through Jesus Christ as a result of being made righteous by faith. Very Lutheran Protestant. If I am correct, Paul draws this conclusion, introduced with un, after a long exposition of how God has revealed a new kind of righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ, which is witnessed by the law and the prophets, such as Abraham, who in the Torah was credited with righteousness by faith. That's found in chapter 4, 1 to 23. I therefore propose the following syntactic structure for 5, 1 to 3a. It's found on your handout also. This structure suggests that Paul uses 4 verbs in 2 groups in the indicative. First, ěχωμεν, and then ἐσχήκαμεν, which is a perfect indicative active without textual variation. and then kαυχώμεθα twice. And note that the form is identical. The subjunctive and the indicative is identical in kαυχώμεθα because it's a verb contract. So my translation below, I think you're in your handout. We have peace with God through Jesus, through whom we have also gained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only that, but we also rejoice in sufferings. Now it could be argued that καυχώμεθα in 5:2-3 are also exhortations, as Hugh Houghton suggests in his forthcoming textual commentary. Yes, it may be noted that this verb is coordinated with the subjunctive καυχώμεθα, let us boast, in the following verse, and there is a further subjunctive at the beginning of the next sentence. However, I think there is good reason to interpret these two occurrences of καυχώμεθα as indicative forms. Paul namely rounds off his exposition of Jesus' work in verses 10-11 by stating, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life. But more than that, we even boast, in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation." So I think that these two verses hark back to the content and structure of 5:1-3. It's clear that we, including the addressees, were formerly God's enemies, but have now been reconciled to God through the death of Jesus. It would be awkward if Paul, in the context of his teaching about Jesus' work to accomplish righteousness and reconciliation, in which we boast, were to urge his audience to keep peace with God and to boast or rejoice. So in my opinion, yeah, it's making a summary of the argument in the beginning of chapter 5. Moreover, there is only one imperative used rhetorically and one hortative subjunctive in a diatribe, as a quote, before 5:1. From chapter 6 and onwards, however, 61 imperatives and 7 hortative subjunctives follow. An exhortation is therefore less appropriate here in 5:1. Robert Jewett, on the other hand, argues that the assessment of what is appropriate based on the context is highly subjective, and the choice of indicative is the result of a long interpretive tradition that has read the letter more as an objective, dogmatic account than a situationally contingent writing. Jewett then goes on to cite Stanley Porter, who he thinks has presented compelling evidence, arguing that the indicative ἐσχήκαμεν cannot be parallel to ἔχωμεν because it's in a subordinate relative clause. But, oops, here we go again. Pause. I disagree with Stanley Porter. Yes, in the main clause, okay. Yeah. In the main clause, Paul says that we have peace, an object, through Jesus Christ, and then he adds, through whom we also have access, a second object, I think. But this kai, followed by a second object, make it most natural to see ἐσχήκαμεν as parallel to ἐχόμεν. On the other hand, the subjunctive would of course be unexpected, and one could argue that it's therefore to be preferred as the lectio difficilior. However, I believe that in a case like this, the criterion of the more difficult reading is not as important as scribes evidently easily confused similar verb forms without regard to the resulting difference in meaning, as we saw in Galatians 6:10. To sum up, although external evidence favors reading B, there is early and relatively strong support for reading A, and scribes could easily have confused the letters in both directions without reflecting about the difference in meaning. The main reason for preferring the indicative here is based on intrinsic evidence considerations of Pauline's theology, style, and syntax, especially in regard to the immediate context, 5:1-11, and the fact that the author's admonitions seem to be concentrated to later chapters. Yes.
Thank you, Tony, for your really insightful presentation, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. There is floor for questions, obviously, so please feel free to ask any questions, any remarks.
Just a very quick remark that UBS 3, and I think 2 and 1 as well, it had a C rating that got upgraded to A and 4, and he was issued down to 12.
So it has
12.
one.
Yeah.
When you read the first committee's judgment, it sounded rather, they were very persuasive. Only the indicative here. So. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is an omega indicative unthinkable?
Very good point. So you can I mean, in the minds of the scribes, yes. That's the main thing. But I haven't looked into the spelling matters as you have done. So,
well,
do you have some light to?
Yeah, in some ways it goes against what I tend to argue, which is that isochrony, the long and short vowel, has not occurred. So that goes against. Yeah.
So yourself, you think it's an indicative? But spelled
I want to fit an indicative omega in my model, but obviously at a later stage that is fully possible.
So any other questions?
So question from Dirk. If ěchωmen and ἐsχήκαμεν are parallel, what do you make to the change in tense then?
Well, perfect. The perfect is very close to the present in a way. So should we make how big deal is that in this case? And it's a good question, and I could use like accordance to see other examples maybe. That's my first instinct. But also that the perfect has a leaning toward the present, I guess, in this context.
Any other question?
How many vote for the indicative?
Yeah, that is true. Like the perfect would probably be closer to the indicative. This is like grammatically speaking, it's more like can indicate like a stative action. So it would make sense. It would not be necessarily an argument against the indicative. It's, yeah, just any other questions? Otherwise, I'm sure that there might be plenty of questions later after